some sacrifices, some living water, and divvying up the land, all today on another episode of the Bible in 1 year with the Preacher's Husband. Today we're going through Ezekiel chapter 46, 47, and 48, and tomorrow we're going to start on a new book. We're going to the book of Joel, and we're going to do chapters 1 through 3. So, all of it essentially. Let's get started. So we find ourselves right here in Ezekiel 46, talking about sacrifices. Now, it starts out here as talking about the gates and which gate's going to be open and why. And the east gate of the outer court was permanently closed, as we talked about earlier, but the east gate of the inner court could be opened during special days like the Sabbath and the New Moon Festival. So I found that to be a little interesting. The prince was to enter from the outside through the portico of the temple, and the priests were to sacrifice his burnt offerings and his fellowship offerings there. The people of the land in this part of Ezekiel refers to the whole community that worshiped Yahweh in this manner. We get to verses 4 through 8, and the burnt offering and the grain offerings that were required of the prince on the Sabbath and the new moon are talked about. And of course, the Mosaic law, I found some differences here. The Mosaic law called for 2 lambs and no rams for the offering on the Sabbath. If we remember that from Numbers chapter 28, versus here it's calling for 6 lambs plus a ram for that Sabbath sacrifice. So there are some differences here, and I'm not going to point all of those out because we could get kind of crazy in those lists of comparisons. But the point is here that the sacrifices here are updated and they are different from the original Mosaic laws. And the fact that the prince had sons here, to me, this also argues against identifying him as the Messiah, because the Messiah would not have children, according to Christianity. Now, according to Judaism, that's a completely different perspective, but according to Christianity, he would not have descendants. So, that brings us to chapter 47. So, in 47, we're talking about the life-giving river here in verses 1 through 12, and I found this to be fascinating, and it actually correlated to the book of Revelation somewhat when it addresses the consummation of all human history, so to speak. This may be best seen in this river of life flowing from God's temple to bring healing to the land. Now in verses 6 through 7, the abundance of trees in this vision here correlates to the fruitfulness of the Garden of Eden back in Genesis that we talked about in Genesis chapter 2. And this suggests that Ezekiel was shown a new creation for the coming age. Now here, as in the Garden of Eden account, the surplus is possible because of this marvelous stream, or this river of life, so to speak, that flows in its midst. Now, since the river now comes from the temple instead of from the Garden of Eden, the temple is probably that new center of creation, or the equivalent of what the center of creation was in that story. So a little correlation there with those. We read about that in Psalm 46, verse 4 as well. And then it goes on to talk about the Sea of Foul Water, which is basically another way to say the Dead Sea, and the future blessing that's going to happen on this region, in the region of the Dead Sea, how it's going to be full of life in the future. And these trees will remain perpetually green and provide an endless supply of food for nourishment, because they draw nourishment from the water that comes from the sanctuary, or that water from the temple, the water of life. Now, what else could that be? That fruitfulness that we talk about, that could be our deeds, that could be our works, that could be the good things that we do, and the nourishment that we get from this water of life. That could be nourishment from God as well, couldn't it be? It could be alluding to how God is going to feed us all, and God is going to nourish us, and that gives us that eternal bounty, that eternal life that we talk about in the New Testament so often. And then one point that I really liked in this was verses 21 through 23, where it talked about the aliens how aliens are going to be allotted an inheritance among the tribes of Israel as well. They're not going to be set aside and pushed aside and kept separate anymore. The distinction between the resident aliens and the Israelites are going to be eliminated. They're all going to be coming together. They're all, if you want a part of God's kingdom, you can have it. You can be a part of God's kingdom. Essentially, God is bringing all people together at this point. And I found that to be a pretty positive thing. So let's move on to chapter 48. So chapter 48, I've thrown a couple of maps up here. That way you can look at it. And there's a bunch of maps that you can find on the internet about, what Israel might look like at this time and where this possible new temple's going to be. And of course, there's two maps here, and both of them have two completely different outline drawings. You'll notice the northern borders are different. The southeastern border's different. The southern border's different. The placement of the temple is different in each of these as well. So these are both just anticipations of what it may look like once this allotment has happened. Now, the tribal allotments of Israel in the coming age are going to begin at the northern frontier with Dan, as you see here on your maps. And since the tribe of Levi was not to receive any land, Joseph's two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, would inherit land just as they had done throughout the history of Israel. I did find it interesting, though, that the order of the tribes listed here had absolutely no conformity to any of the other lists in Israel's history and throughout the Bible. The tribes that originated through the handmaids of Jacob's wives are placed on kind of the outer extremities of the land, and the tribes that originated from Jacob's wives, Rachel and Leah, will be given land in the center of the nation, kind of in the prime portions there. Judah and Benjamin will, of course, occupy the privileged positions next to the land's special sacred portions. The side of Jerusalem with the surrounding open land, if you read in verse 15, is interesting that it was exactly 50 times that of the temple, which was those measurements were given in chapter 42. So I found that to be interesting. I hope that this has helped your studying today, and if it has, that's awesome. I hope I encourage you to watch another episode tomorrow. Hit that like button, that subscribe button. Of course, click the little jingle bell so you can get notified the next time I upload a video. And hit that little boxing glove if you're rumbling with me on Rumble. And we will see you tomorrow for another episode of the Bible in 1 year with the Preacher's Husband. We'll see you then.